Welcome to the Post-Traumatic Growth and the Role of Spiritual First Aid. In this session, we will explore the definition of trauma, its connection to faith, and the different methods of facilitating post-traumatic growth. We will also offer a hope-filled response that by God's grace, trauma can lead to growth and greater strength. Alida van Dijk and Joseph Kamphuis will co-lead this session. Alida is a certified educator with the Canadian Association for Spiritual Care and is an approved clinical supervisor for the College of Registered Psychotherapists of Ontario. She is Executive Director of the Community Counselling Centre of London in Ontario. Joe serves as a part-time pastor at Chelwood CRC in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and a full-time chaplain in the New Mexico Air National Guard, a component of the United States Air Force.
So, as Sarah said, I'm Joe Kamphuis. I'm a chaplain with the New Mexico Air National Guard. I'm pastor at Chelwood Christian Reformed Church. I really came across this idea of post-traumatic growth working with some of our folks that are in behavioral health, because I also serve as a suicide prevention program manager for my wing. And so that kind of all comes together and just became a passion for me. And so following the theme of the day, I guess I'll introduce myself this way. I'm a person who needs a lot of recognition. And when I don't get that recognition, I don't do well. I also am somebody who is an unapproachable introvert. I literally had the Air Force tell me that I was unapproachable when I was in basic chaplain course. And so I'm an unapproachable introvert who doesn't always like to talk to people. And I also found out yesterday that I have a little bit of a high number on my LDL cholesterol. So those are some of the weaknesses that I have that I'm learning to delight in and that I offer up to God for his purposes. So Sarah kind of shared the story of how we ended up here. With this idea of post-traumatic growth. It was, I was presenting on spiritual fitness and a tool that you can use to assess and also develop spiritual fitness. And then Alida afterwards I just basically mentioned the word post-traumatic growth, and it just became a buzzword in the whole session. And so Alida came up to me afterwards and she goes, "Why are people so intrigued by this idea of post-traumatic growth? I did my entire dissertation on that." And so I was like, well, then I think you definitely need to be the one that presents on it. So I guess what I offer is I brought up a word, and Alida will be the one who will present on all of that. And I wanted to call her Dr. Van Dijk, but she doesn't want that. So we'll call her Alida. But she definitely deserves all of that accolade because she has put a lot of effort and time and energy into this study, and has something to teach us today that's really going to be powerful. So if we could put up the slides, we'll go to the abstract. So go to the next slide. So in this session, we will explore trauma and post-traumatic growth. So that's what we're talking about. Not just trauma, but also growth that comes after it. And the other piece that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about what are some of the interventions that we can engage in that will help us and help others to be able to facilitate that growth post-trauma. And so that's kind of what we're talking about. And at the end, there'll be some time to interact with these ideas through breakout groups. So let's go to the next slide. So our outline is that, first of all, we're going to talk about how it's grounded in our faith. Post-traumatic growth is something that is an inherently biblical concept. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. And then Alida is going to do a presentation on post-traumatic growth and spiritual first aid. And then we'll have opportunity to engage the material, and we'll have some wrap-up time. So let's go on to the inherently biblical, right? So if you look at scripture, you see a lot of people who grew past their trauma, and sometimes because of it. If you think of Hagar, who was Ishmael's mother, she grew past her trauma of being singled out, used, separated, sent out into the wilderness, but in that discovering who God was, the God who sees her, right? And then you have Joseph, who was Jacob's son, who was sold into slavery in Egypt. And God used it. And Jacob even could say at the end of his life that, God intended this for the saving of many lives. And so God was working through his trauma. And then, of course, you have Job, who suffered, and a lot of questions around that, a lot of questions that he had. But in the end, his strength and his trust in God became so much stronger when he realized that God was there and God cared about him. And then, of course, the Apostle Paul, and that's who we're going to kind of center on today, is the Apostle Paul. And I'm going to use the lens of his letter, the second letter to the church in Corinth, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 8 and 9. This is what Paul says. He says, "We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." And so if you look at those verses and you see those different things that are referenced there, hard-pressed, perplexed, persecuted, struck down. But then you go into the next part and it's the but not. And that's where you find the resiliency, and that's where you find the growth. We are hard-pressed, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. I found it interesting as I read through this that, and as you read through 2 Corinthians, this letter that Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, his greatest trauma, which you would think it was, when he was beaten to death and left outside the city and they thought he was dead and he got up and walked away. Other times that he had been given the 39 lashes by the Romans and all the different things that happened to him physically. But it seems like his greatest trauma was the rejection that he experienced by the people of the church at Corinth. And so he wrote this entire letter as a defense, as a way of coming back to them and saying, you know who I am. But all through it, he was relying upon God and his grace, and you see all kinds of images that come through it. I encourage you to read through the letter and see it. And so then the question is, and it kind of relates to what Mandy shared with us earlier, where do we see ourselves in this? What kind of traumas have we experienced? I said at the beginning that I'm a person who really loves recognition, and when I don't get it, I don't do well. I told this in our group earlier, but I'll share it with you now too. When I was in the church I was pastoring before here in Albuquerque, it was something that they always celebrated was Pastor Appreciation Month. And it came one year, 5 years down the road. I'm thinking, okay, they do this every year. 5th year, it's going to be a big extravaganza. It's going to be a huge thing. And they didn't do anything. They didn't say nothing. They didn't do anything. There was nothing. It was less than what it had been the years before. And I don't know what that did to me, but there was something inside of me that just broke. It was very difficult, and it ended up in a very difficult conversation with the council following that. And it was a time of learning for me. I still don't know if I've really figured out exactly what's going on there. But that trauma, that emotional trauma, was something that I would remember so much more than any of the physical traumas that I might have experienced in life. And so maybe that's true for you too. Maybe you've been questioned as a pastor or as a chaplain, and you've felt some of these same things. And so going on to the next part then is 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And this is kind of our theme verse for this whole session here. But God said to me, this verse 9, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I'll boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That's why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses and insults and hardships and persecutions and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." So you see, Paul, as he was going through this letter, he kind of was tempted at one point, and you see that in chapters 10 and 11, that he was tempted to talk about his own experiences with God and talk about the ways that he had suffered more for the gospel than anyone else, and to kind of rest on those credentials. That was his temptation. But in his most mature moment, he comes to this point of surrender, realizing that when he's weak, then he's strong. And so discovering that strength in the weakness and in spite of the weakness. And I think it's really important that in verse 9, we see that he says, therefore, I'll boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses. Why? So that Christ's power may rest on me. And I think every one of us will be able to tell stories about how those traumas or those difficulties that we've had have presented opportunities for the gospel and for Christ's power to rest upon us. And so I just want you to reflect on that and think about that as we get ready to go into our sessions at the end. Just think about what personal traumas you've experienced and what growth may have happened after that. And so that's really what we want to talk about, is we want to talk about growth after trauma is possible. And that offers hope. And that's really what we want to do. And the next thing then is to realize that our interventions, the things that we do, can facilitate that growth. And so on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Alida, and she's going to lead us through some of the academic stuff of this. And so I hope that it'll be helpful and learning. So go ahead, Alida. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. So yes, I am Alida van Dijk. I'm from London, Ontario, and I'm currently the executive director of a subsidized not-for-profit counseling center. It's the Community Counseling Center of London. And I'm also a supervisor educator, and I have some pastoral counseling education students that work under my supervision to provide the counseling services in this community counseling center. And yes, as Sarah said, I did do my dissertation on post-traumatic growth. And I was thinking that, yeah, I continue to learn about trauma and post-traumatic growth. And I have a sense that my interest in this topic of post-traumatic growth comes out of my experiences of relational trauma. And so basically my writing the dissertation is my journey towards healing or journey towards post-traumatic growth. I really wanted to learn more about that. So I'm going to present a lot of the ideas here that you will see from these slides come directly from my dissertation research, and I'm going to be going through this pretty quickly. You will have access, it's already posted on the chaplaincy website. You'll have access to this PowerPoint, so you don't have to take notes, as well as there's some resources and other materials there. So I'm going to start with some quotations, and as you hear these quotations, just see what resonates with you in terms of if there's any words that or phrases that jump out to you. Trauma does not reside in the external event that induces physical or emotional pain, nor even in the pain itself, but in our becoming stuck in our primitive responses to painful events. This comes out of my learning about somatic experiencing, so a very body-oriented psychotherapy for healing trauma. And the notion is, Peter Levine is the founder of this somatic experiencing, and the basic concept is that when we all have self-protective responses, and so when a trauma happens, we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and how we're created, those responses, the fight, flight, or freeze responses kick in. Now what happens though then sometimes is that those responses don't get to deactivate. That energy of the fight, flight, or freeze response doesn't get to move through our bodies as it does in animals. If you see an animal that's been traumatized, it freezes or so, like a bird that flies into your window and is still alive. It's frozen or like it doesn't move for a while, but then it can shake off and then carry on. Humans don't do that. Like sometimes our self-protective responses get stuck. So here's a quotation from Peter Levine. Trauma is a fact of life. It does not, however, have to be a life sentence. In our suffering lies also our salvation. And then another quote, trauma is caused when we are unable to release blocked energies to fully move through the physical emotional reactions to hurtful experience. Trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. The salvation then is to be found in the body. And I highlighted it and made bigger this, what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. We're going to come back to that phrase. And as has been mentioned, this is my topic of my dissertation that I completed in 2016. And the title of that is Not Sinking with the Titanic: Personal Agency as a Key Factor in Transforming Trauma into Post-Traumatic Growth. I was more interested not so much in the trauma, but I'm like, how does that shift? How do we turn a trauma into growth? And in the presentation, there's the link to the full dissertation should you choose to read that. Not sinking with the Titanic is, I use that metaphor. It became the title of my dissertation. I love metaphors. I'm an English major. So, and as we have engaged in our chaplaincy training, often we have to think of what is an image, like our pastoral image or identity, right? So we think in metaphors. We often listen for metaphors in the stories that our clients or our patients tell us. And so this metaphor of not sinking with the Titanic directly emerged from one of my research participants. Nancy, not her real name, but she said, yeah, we had to change. If we didn't change, we would have died. At some point, it was a decision that we made that we were not going to sink. And we finally decided that we were going to get in a lifeboat and we were going to save ourselves. And in more than one of the participant stories that I heard for my qualitative research project, the participants talked in terms of life or death, right? So either the traumatic event, they thought they were going to die in that experience, or in the as they were experiencing the trauma and not able to move forward, it was a choice that they had to make. And they talk about it as a life or death choice point decision, and people choose life. So even in the literature review on trauma, there's lots of metaphors. So here are some of them. A trauma is, the metaphor is an affliction of the powerless, or traumas are described as psychological earthquakes. A book that talks about trauma as shattered assumptions and shocks to our inner worlds. And here's a quotation that also explores a metaphor for trauma. We know it takes faith to believe in God, but we sometimes forget how much faith it takes to believe in truth, justice, goodness, and even love. Trauma challenges this faith and in some cases shatters it into tiny pieces. We are left groping around on the floor for the ruins of our once unquestioned beliefs. So, what is post-traumatic growth? How would we define it? Post-traumatic growth is not a return to the before the trauma. It's not a return to baseline. Post-traumatic growth is a positive change that comes about after our lives have been impacted by trauma. And Joe, if I can use what you said earlier about this experience of not having the pastoral recognition, happen, and something inside you broke, you said. So sometimes that's what it feels like when we experience a trauma, that something breaks inside of us. And so then how do you carry on with that brokenness? And post-traumatic growth is the new life, the new rebirth that happens, an experience of improvement that for some persons is deeply profound. Doesn't mean that you can carry on as if or figure out a way to ignore the trauma and carry on as if the trauma hadn't happened. But post-traumatic growth incorporates and integrates that experience into your life story in a way that promotes health and healing, and can be so personal growth can be better than it was before, although the trauma and the experience was awful. Traumatic events can be likened to earthquakes that sometimes open up crevices deep down into those core beliefs, values, and ways of coping that formed us as children. Spiritual and pastoral care can help people identify and explore these embedded theologies that surface in trauma. And that's the whole, those metaphors of shattered assumptions, or our core beliefs, things that we thought about the world, that the world is safe, and that maybe even that God is a loving God and he cares for us and he's going to protect us. And then a trauma happens. And all of those beliefs, that everything that you've been taught from going to church all your life kind of seems meaningless. And that is, sometimes more difficult. The suffering in that is so incredible to try to sort through, because now it's like the carpet of your beliefs have been pulled out from under you. Now where's the firm foundation? Where's your footing in life? So the question is then, how do you move from trauma to post-traumatic growth? So I put up here like kind of a time continuum of, so a trauma happens, and there's what happens immediately after that traumatic experience, days, hours after the traumatic experience, and then weeks, months, years after the traumatic experience. And I also recognize that there are some traumas that go on and on and on. So childhood sexual abuse that happens, or any ritualistic abuse that happens over years, that's very traumatic. And so that's not a single event or experience, but that's an ongoing trauma, and that also has deep impacts. Lost my train of thought, but perhaps it'll come back. So I'm going to move into talking about spiritual first aid and psychological first aid. Spiritual and psychological first aid are pretty similar, and I would say the difference is spiritual first aid acknowledges the role of spirituality. As chaplains, we know that we integrate the field of study of theology as well as psychology, right, and social sciences. But I'm going to give definitions both of spiritual first aid and psychological first aid, and you'll notice the similarities in these definitions. So spiritual first aid, a short-term helping tool designed to mitigate the impact of the spiritual, psychological, and physical aspects of crises. And then psychological first aid is defined as compassionate and supportive presence designed to mitigate acute distress and assess the need for continued mental health care. So if we think about first aid, and so this is where it ties in with that continuum that I showed you. First aid often happens, first responders, this is at the scene of the traumatic event. I'll go back to that slide for, so spiritual and psychological first aid are specifically what is the first response to trauma and traumatic events. And then also, I do want to point out too that I'm, painfully aware that we're living in a time of an ongoing sustained, I don't know if it's a trauma, it could be traumatic for some people, but we live in a pandemic. We live in a pandemic, and then we have all, the systemic racism that's been risen to the top of our awareness as well, and that this impacts people. This could be it could be traumatic, and so even as I'm giving this presentation, my question to all of you also is, so if this pandemic is traumatic for folks, how do we then engage in spiritual first aid with the people that we come in contact with? And ongoing, and the thing is, we're right in the middle of this because we don't know the end. So that all that uncertainty, so that raises the question. I don't have answers, but we can definitely discuss that. This is a slide with just information of summaries of spiritual first aid. There is a chapter that is provided to you, chapter 9 from an author called Taylor, who talks about spiritual first aid, and you can read that. So I'm not gonna you can read that article, so I'm not going to give the content and the details of that. There's also from the Humanitarian Disaster Institute has a information on what spiritual first aid is. And then also there's a course a free course from Johns Hopkins University you can take on Coursera on psychological first aid. And if you compare the interventions or the from both spiritual first aid and psychological first aid, you'll see similarities. But what I want to draw out from this about spiritual first aid is that first and foremost, first aid, spiritual first aid is about being an empathetic witness. And I feel that that's what we do in our profession. We bear witness. We are present with other people and we hold their stories. Being an empathetic witness is about being, not doing. Empathy is the quality of your being, your perceived understanding of being fully present and being in the presence of one who is suffering. A non-anxious presence we talk about in our training. And it's about bearing witness, being an empathetic witness. It isn't passive, it's active. You're observing, you're holding space, you're containing, and you are seeing the person in front of you. And Joe, I think you had something here that you can add in.
Yeah, so I served 2.5 years as a police chaplain with the Albuquerque Police Department as a volunteer. And as part of that, had some interactions with other first responder chaplains. And there was a fire chaplain from down south here in New Mexico who shared with us just this real simple thing, but I think it just is so profound when you get thought into it. Because he says when most people come upon a trauma or they see a lot of stuff happening, their first instinct is to do something. And so you think about that phrase of, don't just stand there, do something, right? You can't just stand there, you got to do something, get moving, do something, right? And that's our first response, that's our first reaction. But what a chaplain does, and a person who comes alongside another person as an empathetic witness in that sense, is the exact opposite. Don't just do something, stand there, be with them, sit with them. Be that as much as possible non-anxious presence that can bring that peace into the midst of the chaos. And I just thought that was a powerful image. So, don't just stand there, do something. Nope. Don't just do something. Stand there. So thanks.
Thanks, Joe. And that's the hardest thing. I mean, I feel like in my training as well, right? I'd rather have something tangible that I can do. To just stand there and be in the power of my being and really believe that that is the best thing that I can do in the moment, that's difficult. So what I've concluded is that spiritual first aid is about support at the time of crisis. And it's your presence that's providing that support. You're being there. You're holding the story. You're being that empathetic witness is providing the support that is needed in the moment. Your nervous system is supporting the other person's nervous system. So if you think about the non-anxious presence, if you can be calm in the face of the chaos that's going on around you and hold that in your nervous system, the other person's nervous system, the phrase, it's not a scientific term, but our nervous systems ping off of each other, right? So my nervous system pings off yours and yours pings off mine. So if I can be supportive presence in that time of crisis, that is what's going to be helpful. You're supporting the other person in the disorientation, right, of a chaos that just happened, in the dislocation of the person, so that they are able to reorient themselves to the present and to their bodies as soon as they are able. This reorientation or returning back into their bodies will happen faster with support, with spiritual and psychological first aid. So, and if this can happen at the time of the crisis or the trauma, then this can mitigate the after effects, like the post-traumatic stress disorder or the effects of trauma that you might need to go for psychotherapy years after to try to work through. transformation of an earlier trauma can still happen years later, right? Again, you don't have to sink with the Titanic. It's not a life sentence. However, if we are able to provide the support at the time of crisis, then that supports that person so that they don't suffer the effects of that post-traumatic stress disorder later. And that raises again my question of what do we do in a pandemic? It's not a one-time event. We are living in it right now. And so how are we providing that spiritual first aid? And how are we all, and the other unique, we are all in this same scenario together. So even though we might be the chaplains and the caregivers, we also are maybe experiencing the trauma and the exhaustion of having to minister in a pandemic. So how are we also finding the support that we need in this time of crisis? So here again is this time continuum. So it kind of shows, you know, as it's spiritual and psychological first aid is most helpful directly when the trauma is happening, and then post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic growth can be achieved weeks, months, years after the traumatic event. I just want to say a word about what spiritual first aid is not. It's not saying, you all know this, but I'll say it anyway. It's not saying a prayer with someone if you have not first discovered about the person that this would be helpful for them. It's not assuming that you know what is helpful for the person. It's not about fixing. That's the don't just do something, stand there. It's not about fixing. And in the moment of the crisis, and when the person might be just really disoriented or in shock, it's not about getting the person to tell the detailed story of the trauma. So we're going to invite you to break up into, or Chan is going to assign you to your breakout rooms. And let me just read through these questions. They will also be posted in the chat, I believe, and then also queued in your breakout rooms. Do the metaphors and definitions of trauma and post-traumatic growth resonate with you? Are there any words or phrases that jump out at you? How have you experienced God's grace as sufficient during the pandemic? How is God's power made perfect in our weakness during the pandemic? And what does being an empathetic witness during a pandemic look like?